After this broadcast, Anne redrafted her diary thinking of distribution to future readers. She expanded certain entries and clarified certain situations that may not be understood by strangers. She instituted pseudonyms for the sake of her character's anonymity and cut certain scenes that were too intimate for the public. One thing she kept was Kitty, addressing all her entries to the name.
Germany, 1941. During the reign of Hitler's Nazi Party, a wholesaler and salesman of herbs and spices by the name of Otto relocated his family to Amsterdam. When German forces occupied the Netherlands, his two daughters transferred from a public school to a Jewish one in hopes of finding a safer environment. But sadly, this was only the beginning of their trials. In 1942, one of Otto's daughters began writing in the red and white plaid diary she received on her 13th birthday. In her words,
"I hope I will be able to confide everything to you, as I have never been able to confide in anyone, and I hope you will be a great source of comfort and support."
Little did this early teenage girl know that she would become one of the world's most celebrated authors. Her diary is known to us today as the Diary of Anne Frank, and her writings have inspired the faith of generations.
When Anne's sister Margot was summoned to report to forced labor camp in July of 1942, the Frank family went into hiding in the back office of Otto Frank's business. With the aid of a few non-Jewish friends who smuggled in food and other supplies, the Frank family and 4 other Jews lived confined to the secret annex. During this time, Anne wrote regularly in her diary recounting day-to-day life in hiding, from ordinary annoyances to the fear of capture. She discussed typical adolescent issues, as well as her hopes for the future, which included becoming a journalist or a writer.
Hiding from an enemy who is actively hunting you down hardly seems like the ideal environment to begin a writing career. But as we'll come to find, this wasn't something that Anne needed to do for herself, but something she needed to do for the rest of the world. Much like David being pursued by Saul, Anne Frank's writings were serving more than just her.
See how they lie in wait for me. Fierce men conspire against me for no offense or sin of mine, Lord. I have done no wrong, yet they are ready to attack me. Arise to help me. Look on my plight.
Otto Frank stopped running his business while his family was in hiding. But on his return, he found his employees running it on their own. The rooms that everyone hid in were concealed behind movable bookcases. With the assistance of friends, the Franks remained hidden for 2 years.
Anne's diary is not written to herself like many classical diary entries. Instead, addresses her diary as Kitty. During the war, an exiled minister of education sent a message through radio broadcast for all to preserve as much ordinary documents, diaries, letters, simple everyday materials to create an archive as testimony to the suffering of civilians during the Nazi occupation. After this broadcast, Anne redrafted her diary thinking of distribution to future readers. She expanded certain entries and clarified certain situations that may not be understood by strangers. She instituted pseudonyms for the sake of her character's anonymity and cut certain scenes that were too intimate for the public. One thing she kept was Kitty, addressing all her entries to the name.
The diary was found written on loose sheets of paper strewn on the floor of the hiding place. This was after the family's arrest, but before their rooms were ransacked by the Dutch police and the Gestapo. The writings were kept safe and given to Otto Frank after the war, when Anne's death was confirmed in the spring of 1945. The purpose of her diary became clear in her written introduction. She desired to have one person that she could call her truest friend, someone that she could confide her deepest thoughts and feelings. She shared that she was rich with friends and she had many admirers, but she longed for that one true friend that she could share her most innermost thoughts.
There are two versions of the diary. Version A was written in a diary and 2 notebooks. But after hearing the radio broadcast announcing the desire for wartime diaries to document the period, she rewrote it on loose paper, creating version B, editing it to be read by a wide audience. Anne spent most of her free time reading and studying, and she regularly wrote and rewrote her diary entries, especially after the radio broadcast. She wrote about events as they were occurring, a wonderful perspective of the war, but she also wrote about her personal feelings, beliefs, and ambitions. Anne wrote,
I finally realized that I must do my schoolwork to keep from being ignorant, to get on in life, to become a journalist, because that's what I want. I know I can write, but it remains to be seen whether I really have talent. And if I don't have the talent to write books or newspaper articles, I can always write for myself. But I want to achieve more than that. I need to have something besides a husband and children to devote myself to. I want to be useful or bring enjoyment to all people, even those I've never met. I want to go on living after my death. And that's why I'm so grateful to God for having given me this gift, which I can use to develop myself and to express all that's inside me.
And eventually dove into the subject of God.
The best remedy for those who are afraid, lonely, or unhappy is to go outside, somewhere where they can be quite alone with the heavens, nature, and God, because only then does one feel that all is as it should be, and that God wishes to see people happy amidst the simple beauty of nature. As long as this exists, and it certainly always will, I know that then there will always be comfort for every sorrow, whatever the circumstances may be, and I firmly believe that nature brings solace in all troubles.
SS officer Karl Silberbauer of the Nazi intelligence, along with the attachment of German police, stormed the annex on the morning of August 4th, 1944. The families were interrogated and held overnight until they were transferred to the House of Detention. After 2 days, they were transferred to the Westerbork transit camp, where they were assigned to hard labor in the punishment barracks.
On September 3, 1944, the group was deported to the Auschwitz concentration camp and arrived after a 3-day journey. Accompanying them on the train was Blome Evers Emden, a friend of Margot and Anne. Blome saw Anne, Margot, and their mother regularly in Auschwitz and was interviewed on documentaries accounting her time with the Frank women in Auschwitz. Upon arrival at Auschwitz, Otto Frank was separated from his family due to the SS forcibly splitting the men from the women and children. They would deem some able to work, and they were admitted into the camp, and those deemed unfit for labor were immediately killed. Of the 1,019 passengers, 549, including all children younger than 15, were sent directly to the gas chambers. Anne Frank, who had turned 15 3 months earlier, was one of the youngest people spared from her transport. She was soon made aware that most people were gassed upon arrival and never learned that the entire group from the annex had survived this selection. She reasoned that her father, in his mid-50s and not particularly robust, had been killed immediately after they were separated. Along with the other girls spared from this round of killings, Anne was forced into slave labor in the Auschwitz concentration camp. During the night, they slept in overcrowded barracks and fought against sickness and hunger rampant in the camp. Selections began for women to be relocated to Bergen-Belsen. More than 8,000 women, including Anne and Margot Frank, and August Van Pels, were transported. Edith Frank was left behind and died of starvation. Witnesses later testified her sister Margot fell from her bunk in her weakened state of typhus and was killed by the shock. Anne died 1 day later. The exact date of Anne's death is unknown.
Otto Frank, Anne's father, had survived Auschwitz. After the war ended, he returned to Amsterdam in June of 1945, where he attempted to locate his family. After several weeks, he discovered his wife and his 2 daughters had all perished in the Nazi concentration camp.
In July 1945, after the Red Cross confirmed the deaths of the Frank sisters, a friend gave Otto Frank the diary and a bundle of loose notes that she had saved in the hope of returning them to Anne. Otto Frank later commented that he had not realized Anne had kept such an accurate and well-written record of their time in hiding. In his memoir, he described the painful process of reading the diary, recognizing the events described and recalling that he had already heard some of the more amusing episodes read aloud by his daughter.
Otto Frank, for the first time, saw the more private side of his daughter and those sections of the diary that she didn't discuss with anyone, noting, "For me, it was a revelation. I had no idea of the depth of her thoughts and feelings. She had kept all of these feelings to herself." Moved by her repeated wish to be an author, he decided to have it published. After being rejected by several publishers, it was first published in the United Kingdom in 1952. The first American edition was also published in 1952, under the title Anne Frank, The Diary of a Young Girl.
Simon Wiesenthal said that the diary had raised more widespread awareness of the Holocaust than had been achieved during the Nuremberg trials, because people identified with his child. This was the impact of the Holocaust. This was a family like my family, like your family, and so you could understand this. In June 1999, Time magazine published a special edition titled Time 100, The Most Important People of the Century. Anne Frank was selected as one of the heroes and icons. The magazine described her legacy with the comment, "The passions the book ignites suggest that everyone owns Anne Frank, that she has risen above the Holocaust, Judaism, girlhood, and even goodness and become a totemic figure of the modern world. The moral individual mind beset by the machinery of destruction, insisting on the right to live and question and hope for the future of human beings."
Anne Frank's diary represents much more than just the diary of a teenage girl. She's an important historical and cultural figure who represented the destruction of youth during the war. We mourn the loss of what she could have become with such a great talent and strong ambition. But by Anne's own words, she found a way to fulfill her dreams, even with only 15 short years on this earth. Remember what Anne wrote: "I want to be useful or bring enjoyment to all people, even those I've never met. I want to go on living even after my death." And that's what I'm so grateful to God for having given me this gift, which I can use to develop myself and express all that's inside me. Anne didn't wish for a long life, but for a significant life. She wanted to make an impact with her writing. And by the grace of God, she did. May we do the same with the time we've been given.